Okay. Everybody, good evening. David Graff, Brian Farley. Brian, you want to introduce yourself very briefly?
Perfect. Yeah, my name's Brian Farley, and so I'm with Association Reserves Colorado. I've been doing reserve studies since 2011, and I've completed over 3,000 reserve studies in my own name, reviewed countless others as well on top of that. And really, my goal is with this presentation, at least for you all, is to provide value during those board meetings. Can we give you the data that you need to justify what you're trying to communicate to your owners that potentially there's not enough money? Here's how we get more money. And so my goal with this presentation is to just provide, the data so that you can perform excellently during your board meetings.
Yeah, and I'm David Graff. Oops, excuse me. Moeller Graff. We're community association attorneys here in Colorado. This is my 30th year as a lawyer. I wrote a book on homeowners association meetings called Meeting Martial Arts, and it started as a way of empowering boards and managers to redirect the conversation in a more productive way when emotions got high. And I was listening to Brian speak at a Saturday event of all things about reserve studies, and I know it may not always be the most scintillating topic because it's mixed with numbers and dread. But I thought the way that Brian handled it was really interesting because there was a heckler, although the heckler was not, a toxic individual by my estimation. And he handled it so beautifully. And I thought, wow, if we could talk about some of the things that makes reserve studies and reserve funding so emotionally charged, we might have a better way of, number one, minimizing the stress upon management team members and boards for not having or not feeling like they have enough reserve funds, and also for paving the way to create an opportunity where we talk about how do we bring those reserve funds in. Now, we practice, I mean, you're not limited to Colorado geographically. I am, so I can only talk about what goes on here. But in Colorado, homeowners have reasonably active role, and in some cases, almost essentially a veto power over raising assessments, levying special assessments, and so forth. So it's not simply a board decision in many cases. And so that makes the conversation a little bit more difficult because, of course, we have to involve the people who pay the assessments, the homeowners. One disclaimer: this is educational use only, not legal advice, and we're certainly not psychiatrists, although it may sound like we try to pretend to be. So these are the problems that we see. And the reason it's called the psychology of reserves is not only talk a little bit about the bricks and sticks or the nuts and bolts or the dollars and cents of reserve studies and reserve funding, but also some of the more common objections that we've heard. And I know you've been to a lot of meetings, Brian. I've been to almost coming up on 4,000 HOA meetings now. And you see patterns in the conversation. And so we're going to talk about each of these issues, albeit briefly, because we only have an hour here. No reserve study, having a homemade reserve study, not understanding how to interpret the reserve study. The reserve study indicates a funding model that is too expensive, a desire to do band-aids instead of replacements, the concept of losing to inflation, which also often is intertwined with how do we earn a reasonable rate of return on our invested reserve funds. And one of the more common arguments, especially in older communities, I don't want to give a gift of replacing the roof to future owners who will benefit from it. And then Brian will talk soberingly about the impact of reserves on the ability to resell or sell units. So, do we need a reserve study? Well, what owners say is, why do we need, and it's kind of a double-edged sword because there's a cost to a reserve study, but it's a minor cost. But people will say, why do we need someone to tell us what we already know, which is we don't have enough money? And Brian's response to that question, or a variation of it, was, I agree. I don't go to the doctor for the same reason. I don't want to know what's going on inside my body so that I can be happy rather than knowing the reality of what's going on. Another thing people say is reserve studies are too expensive. And really, that's usually an opening salvo to say, I don't want to spend money to then have to pay more assessments. And I can appreciate that. And we'll talk about that. And then there's reserve studies or projections based upon guesses, meaning we're estimating the remaining useful life. We're estimating how long it's going to continue to last irrespective of that estimation. And then we're going to project a cost replacement estimate based on future numbers that are adjusted for inflation. And so these are the things that owners say. Brian,
And so
tell
the
me.
way that we would want to at least frame this topic of reserve studies, then when you start to hear these sorts of objections, is just clarifying what the reserve study is versus what the reserve study is not. A lot of the times when we run into problems is due to a misalignment of expectations. So for example, if I hire a handyman to come to my house, assuming he can fix all of my plumbing in my house for the cheap price of $500, I'm going to be sorely disappointed when that's not what he does, right? He can maybe hang some pictures, fix some wall stuff. He's not going to do all my plumbing, right? That's an expectation misalignment. When it comes to the reserve study, I like to utilize the framework of a map or a guideline. Now, if I'm taking a road trip with my family for Thanksgiving, the first thing I need to know is number one, where am I going? Where am I headed? What's my destination? The next thing I need to plug into my map is where am I starting? What is my starting point? So the reserve study acts in the same manner. We first of all need to know where are we today? What's our financial situation today for our association? What's our percent funded? How much money do we have? And then we need to figure out what does our destination look like? What is our funding goal? So once we've established where we are today, and then what is our funding goal, we can start to go on our journey. Now, just like any other trip you're going to be taking, what's going to happen is you're going to run into some detours. And so the way to talk about that sort of idea of, is it a guess? How do they even know what's going on? Well, just like any map, we need to recalibrate if we hit a detour. So if I'm going down the road and all of a sudden they're doing road construction, so I have to take a detour, I now need to take my map out, recalibrate where am I today, recalibrating what's my financial standing, recalibrate what are my new current costs, because now the years have changed, right? And we've got new cost estimates. So I need to recalibrate. What hasn't changed is my destination. My destination is to be properly funding my reserves so that every owner takes care of their fair share of the ongoing rate of deterioration for their association. So that's how we would at least want to frame it for your ownership. Again, it is not a crystal ball. No one can predict the future with 100% accuracy, right? And if we could, would we be here today talking to you, right? We would know we'd be in the Bahamas, owning the Bahamas, if we could predict the future with any sort of accuracy. So we need to make sure we understand the framework we're working with here. David, does that sound like something that you've heard before? And I think you're muted too, David.
Sorry, I was typing in the chat, or in the Q&A. Yeah, I hear it all the time, right? Which is, or my response is we need a more accurate picture of what's needed, right? Everyone needs to know the true cost of ownership. That's the misalignment, right? When we have assessments that are artificially low and do not properly account for the planned replacement of the capital infrastructure that we have, we hide the true cost of ownership. And this isn't, I don't want to go on too big a detour, but I call it the condo death spiral, where we continue to artificially hide the true cost of ownership, and poorer people will move in because they're going to pick a house over a $10 a month less assessment. And there's nothing, morally wrong with not having any money, but it becomes a problem for the association to properly fund its obligations. So this condo death spiral is when we continue to hide the true cost of ownership, we dig an economic hole that the association can't dig out of with the people who live in there when the costs become due, right? And everyone needs to know what the true cost of ownership is. And that, from the board's perspective, is in my estimation, in my experience, is a huge relief from the board, because you have the ability to provide the information to the homeowners, who are the ultimate decision makers on these issues. They can vote off the board, they can vote on different directors who don't believe in reserve studies and reserve funding, but at least you've given them the data. And when we don't have an accurate depiction of what it's going to cost to live here, we haven't given them the tools to make an accurate decision on how to fund it. And as a result of that, the board takes on all of the stressing of being able to deliver the outcome of a well-maintained community, right? Well, the homeowners are going to vote for assessments to be higher just because, and that's where the reserve study comes in. So clarity minimizes lawsuits. Okay, Brian?
So if you maybe have heard this phrase before, hold my beer, maybe you've never been near a fraternity before, but this is kind of the impetus of a lot of bad decisions that are made. Basically, you have a group of guys drinking some beer, and they say, "I bet I could jump off that cliff into that lake." And they say, "Great, hold my beer, let me do it." Right. So that's kind of what we're doing here. If we are working on our own reserve study, it is like one of your homeowners saying to a board member, "Hey, hold my beer, let me take a crack at this, and I'm going to get this reserve study done." Of course, many of your owners are very competent. They can work with the spreadsheet. They know how to run with numbers. Potentially, they were a CPA in their past. But there is a difference when you are a homeowner living within a homeowners association and you tell your neighbor, hold my beer, I'm going to set all of the reserve transfers for my association. And if I'm wrong, maybe I might be a little bit biased towards making things a little cheaper than they should be. We want to err on the side of caution. There is really no, in my opinion, no benefit, only downsides when a homeowner or a board member wants to take on that responsibility of potentially making recommendations worth of millions of dollars for your association. But David, that's my opinion. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen homemade reserve studies, and the law in Colorado specifically authorizes them, but I think it's, for any community that has appreciable responsibilities for infrastructure, it doesn't pass the smell test, right? And that's not codified in the statutes, but in my opinion, it's very hard to justify under the business judgment rule, which is we're acting reasonably and within the scope of our authority as a board, right? It's not that expensive, and it gets you out of the middle of being responsible for the outcome, right? And this is the thing that I want to keep talking about is the stress of being responsible. We already have stress as leaders to make the budget, survive the annual assessment levying, and that we have to worry about insurance premiums, which are going up dramatically nationally. You have to worry about people not following the governing documents and people not paying their assessments. Do we have to take on the additional responsibility of telling the entire community that this is how much money you're going to need for the next 15 years? No. And some of the things that depending on what your infrastructure consists of, some of those things may require expertise, a license, experience in general contracting, an understanding of the trades, understanding of how buildings are built. So you put yourself in a situation where you can take on individual liability for not acting reasonably. And that's not any place that we want a volunteer leader to be. And even more compelling, if that doesn't do it for you, homeowners don't buy it. They just, in my experience, do not believe it when the board is telling the homeowners to pay more on a reserve study that the board or a member of the board created. There just isn't the trust or credibility. And so they'll say that we don't trust. What do you know about reserve studies? We don't trust your ability to do it. To me, it's the price of diligence, right? The cost relative to the infrastructure replacement cost is minimal, right? And the owners just need to believe it. And there is psychology to this. The talk was called The Psychology of Reserves for a reason. We're trying to figure out, why do people continue to oppose reserves? And are there ways that we can understand the psychology better to make it easier to encourage people to review the reserve study and to support the idea that we need to fund in accordance with it? And it's like wearing a uniform, right? Authority bias. It's proven. People believe experts more than non-experts. Reserve study providers are experts, and they're going to get a boost of credibility in terms of what they say just because they are experts. And they often will get a little bit of a boost in the credibility because in many cases, they don't live in the community that they're studying. There's also the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a psychological term. When someone says, hold my beer, I'm going to do a reserve study, it's been proven that people with diminished expertise often overestimate their ability to handle complicated topics. And, for a condominium with common elements and multiple floors and perhaps an elevator, stairwells, and balconies, the reserve study can be prepared pretty quickly, but it requires an understanding of how those components fit together, how they wear out, where water gets in, and where it's likely to be deteriorating more quickly. And people who do homemade reserve studies without the expertise, you have to question whether they have the ability to do it. Ryan.
And so then if we can encourage our owners to reach out and get a reserve study, another problem though that you may hear is, okay, fine, we'll go outside, we'll get a professional reserve study from a non-biased individual who is an expert in only completing reserve studies. But we know that we're going to be confused by the results. Sometimes a reserve study we produce can be hundreds of pages. But really, it's actually simple to break it down. So as we can see on this slide right here, the majority of the data or the information that you need to make a decision during your board meeting can be utilized in a simple page. On our reserve studies particularly, we utilize a cover sheet or an executive summary where we try to try to condense all the data that needs to be interpreted for the board to make an accurate and wise financial choice. So on the executive summary, you'll see right off the bat, we've got the starting reserve balance. So that's our starting point. Remember, where are we starting now? We have the fully funded reserve balance, which is the second line in the gray box. And that's telling us how much of our value of our components have deteriorated, or what's the total deteriorated value accumulated for our components. We just divide those two numbers together, and then we get our percent funded, which is 16% funded. And our 16% funded in this situation tells us that this association is at a high risk. Now you might think, okay, well, we're a high risk, that's bad. But if you can see in our reserve transfers, this particular client doesn't need to do much else. They're currently putting away $669,000. Our recommendation for our recommended 2025 fully funded transfers is $670,000. Okay, so I know I said a lot of numbers there quite quickly, but what I'm trying to point out to you is the rest of the reserve study, the rest of the data that we include within the reserve study is only backing up this information here. And so once you've established, okay, what's our percent funded? Are we in a good position, a fair position, or a poor position? What's the next thing we need to know? The next thing we need to know is, okay, well, what is the reserve specialist recommending to us? What is the reserve transfer rate we need to be putting in to be on the right path? Well, you can see, here's the recommendation.
Oh, sorry.
Now, and that's perfect. No, and actually a good lead into the next slide. Now, if they say, great, we don't care what the reserve specialist says, well, then even we can break it down even more simply, excuse me. What we found is that when a client is at 30% funded or below, or an HOA is at 30% funded or below, they are at a statistically higher risk of special assessments and deferred maintenance. Whereas statistically speaking, when associations are at 70% funded and greater, statistically speaking, they're at a much lower risk, at less than 1%. So what we're trying to do here is on just that one executive summary page, which again is one page that is only showing us what the rest of the reserve study tells us.
Yeah.
Right here. Yeah. It's just saying, okay, here's where we are, and then here's where we need to go. So the goal is not to make it hard to interpret. The goal is really to make it as simple to interpret as possible, so it can be communicated effectively during a board meeting. So the board and the owners can communicate properly to say, we need more money. Here's what we need to do, right? Or we're in a good spot. We'll keep going where we're at. Or in this particular situation, this was a board president who called me and was all nervous saying, I thought we were in a good spot. We need a special assess, right? And I said, no, we don't need a special assess at all. Your percent funded, yes, is lower, but this particular client had to do a large code upgrade because they had to remodel their clubhouse. So they had a lot of one-time expenses that kind of drained their reserves. But now moving forward, they're on the right track. So I assured her, no, you can go to the board meeting and said, we did things right. We took care of all the projects that need to be taken care of, and we can move forward, because look at our reserve study. It tells us that we need to be putting in a little bit more than what we're currently putting in. And I want to address a quick question that's in the chat. It says, of the percentage of reserve studies we've completed, what's the criteria of being 100, 75, 50 to 25% funded? So on average, what we're finding is kind of a bell curve spread. About 30% of the clients that we work with, if you go to the next slide, David,
Sure.
30% of the clients we work with on average are in the 30 to 0% funded. So that's where 30% of them are. 30% are in the 70% funded and above. And then about 40% are in the middle. And so what's the takeaway here? The takeaway here is that it's just as likely to be well funded as it is poorly funded. So if the assumption is, well, we're going to be poorly funded, that's not true. That's not a true assumption. And actually the data shows us otherwise. And so, David, if you
Yeah.
can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about kind of another problem,
This
another
one.
issue that we've seen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
is where,
You
what's
get it.
that?
And you have sticker shock.
Correct. Right. You get the reserve study, and maybe that number that we put on the reserve study was more than what was anticipated. And it can be fear inducing. And we understand that completely. The thing is, when we're talking about the reserve study assets, we don't want it to be a moral judgment. Rather, we want it to just show, here's the data and here are the costs that need to be funded for. This is not to say your association is good or bad, or that you need to do all these projects right now. For example, when I go to the doctor and I get my blood pressure taken, my hope, right, is that I'm 120 over 80. Now, I'm generally over that. Now, if I'm 160 over something, that's a bad position, but I need to know where I am, right? It's not what I wanted to hear. Kind of like if you find out that your roof is more expensive than anticipated, just because I don't want to hear it doesn't mean it's not true. So the fact is, we need to know the data first. We need to know what the true costs are. Then we can make a decision. So just like my blood pressure, if it is, for whatever reason, extremely high one day, I need to now make some changes. Just like when you get your reserve study and you find out some of these components are more expensive than anticipated, what are we going to do? Well, what we would then like to then encourage your owners to understand is, it may seem expensive on paper, but what we have found is that when an association is putting proper funds away, it comes out to be about $3 to $5 per day per unit, or about $90 to $150 per month per unit. So we could say this is about a small cup of coffee now at Starbucks. And so the argument here is not that you should trade your latte for your association dues, right? That's not a fun trade to make. I'm not trying to say that. I'd much rather pay for my coffee than I would pay for my HOA dues. But what we're trying to say is that it's doable. It can be done, right? We can fund our reserves adequately. It's just going to take a decision to make that effort.
Yeah, I mean that sounds like cumulatively $150 a unit per month sounds like a ton of money to some associations, right? And we hear that all the time. Oh, sorry, Brian, you want to talk about the construction cost index?
Sure, sure. No, we keep on going because you do hear that. And I think the thing is, if we delay that idea though any further, right? If we say to our owners, it sounds like too much money, let's just wait till next year to tackle that problem. The only thing we need to remember is inflation and the scope of work by deferring that maintenance will not slow down. So this is a really great construction cost index. It's called the Mortenson Construction Cost Index for the Denver metro area. In the last 5 years, but we haven't have a full year for 2025. So the last 4 years, you can see from 2020 to 2024, we've experienced about a 40% increase in costs for construction related materials. So by just delaying a project 1 year down the line, we've increased the cost substantially. And then with the picture with the wood siding, what you'll see there is, again, if your board and your ownership agree, this is too expensive, we don't want to tackle this problem today, we'll tackle it next year, or we'll let the next board handle it. Now we've increased the scope of work of the project, so the cost has gotten greater. So now we have a double whammy. We have inflation impacting the costs due to just prices going up, and now the scope of work has increased. So if we say this year it's too expensive, I can't afford it, well, it's only going to be more expensive the next year.
Yeah, and this was the comment that was made at Brian's presentation. We don't have the money, we'll never have the money. It's unrealistic. Well, those are emotional based arguments that have nothing to do with the property. And the common one we get is, well, somebody might lose their home. And the last thing we want anyone to do is to lose their home because they can't afford to stay in it. But at the end of the day, the property has funding requirements based on specific maintenance that can be identified. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what the least affluent owner in the community makes or has. And we can't set policy for a corporation that exists in perpetuity based on someone's hard circumstances that ultimately can make the entire property uninhabitable as a matter of code. And we see this all the time with roofs and sewer lines and other, we don't see it all the time where people are moving out, but the threat of people being moved out by a municipality saying that you can't live there anymore exists. And so, yes, someone may lose their home, but if we fund based on that philosophy, then everyone will ultimately lose their home because it will not be habitable. The project determines the price, and that price will be paid no matter what, or the people will be moving out. That is just the reality, right? And when we hear this, it's too expensive. I get it, right? The last thing I would want to do is pay more assessments. And I think the overwhelm has to be managed a little bit by taking a breath and saying, okay, we don't have to fund it today. We don't have to become fully funded tomorrow. We don't have to win. We just have to start, right? And when we start and we get people's expectations adjusted to paying higher numbers towards the reserve fund, it becomes easier to create some momentum towards that. In Colorado and nationally, to a large degree, we saw insurance premiums go up significantly. And at least in our market here, a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that the insurance premiums were going that high. And they went really high. But there were other markets in the United States that had been already accustomed to paying those premiums for insurance. And so to some extent, we were shielded, I think, from those market effects here. And then we got them and it was very disturbing. And I think the same shift in consciousness is going to have to happen with the reserve funds to say, you know what, we're not used to putting away that kind of money. We're not used to paying that level of assessments, but it's going to be cheaper to do that than to wait and to let, the infrastructure collapse, right? Loss aversion just means people feel losses twice as acutely as they feel equivalent gains, right? No one wants to give up their money. It's a painful thing, even if to give that up brings them twice as much joy down the road. It's not really gonna matter. And the time factor, right? People will put off an assessment increase now and worry about the consequences later. And we all do this to some extent in our lives or have done it, right? But this temporal discounting of, oh, we'll deal with it in the future is going to come too quickly. And when it comes, the reality is going to be too large for many communities, I think, to handle if they don't get a handle on it now. So, Band-Aids.
Yes. So now we've encouraged the owners to say, okay, we got the reserve study. We're shocked by how expensive it is, but we're not ready to actually pull the trigger on these projects. Can't we just make Band-Aid repairs, right? Instead of doing a full replacement, can't we just Band-Aid it along? Now, when you're driving down the road, you may have seen this because you run into this Aspen Creek condos, right, on the side of the road, and it looks familiar, right? It is sloppy, it's disorganized, and in fact, it's seen better days. It's got a 5 o'clock shadow, theoretically, on itself. So can't we just push things aside? Rather, let's not spend the money now. Let's just save it, but we'll still fix the items. But the problem is this is not actually how the reserve study works. So when we think about the costs on your reserve study, this is how we actually accumulate the costs for it. It's not just, it's a $10,000 expense. If you don't pay for the $10,000 expense, you save the money. Rather, the fully funded balance, which was on that prior slide, or what we call the accumulated value of deterioration. Actually, I'm sorry, you can just go to that other back. Yeah.
This one here. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So what we call the fully funded balance on the reserve study. This is how the math works on it. So let's just say, look at your computer screen right now. Let's say this computer that you're looking at is $10,000. You just bought this computer. Therefore, in year one, in order to be keeping pace with the rate of deterioration of that computer, you need $1,000 in your reserves. You need $1,000 to be 100% funding your reserves for your computer. Year 5, you need $5,000. Year 9, 9,000. Year 10, you now pay for that new computer on the 10th year because it has a 10-year life. and now you're back at 1, right? So by completing the project on time, we've now reduced the total cost burden or the accumulated value deterioration for that particular expense. However, let's just say you have the ownership and they say, well, we don't want to pay that $10,000. Rather, we want to save that money because it feels better for us to save the money. That's that loss aversion that David just talked about. So instead, they say, let's spend $500 or let's maybe spend $1,000 to repair the computer so that we can push it along a little further. The problem is all that's done is this cost keeps on going. So it's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 10,000. We still have to then inevitably replace this computer. And maybe next year it's going to be $11,000. So instead of spending $10,000 to replace this computer or this project on time, we now just spent an additional $500 to repair it. And it's now going to cost us $11,000. So we've now paid more in repairs and delays than what it would have cost us to just replace the component. So the argument here is that if we push these projects aside, or we say we're just going to do ongoing repairs over time, it saves us money. That's not the case. It's going to cost the association more money if we just apply Band-Aids and we just do repairs.
Yeah. I mean, it's too much to fix it all at once. You know, at some point you can only repair something so many times. And you think about buying a car with 200,000 miles on it, right? Some people do it that know how to fix cars, but most people know that when their car, depending on what they drive, gets over a certain mileage, it's going to cost them a lot more in replacing the worn out infrastructure of the car than it is to buy a new car, right? And it's a depressing cycle of too late, too small fixes and small assessments that demoralize the community, that make people feel depressed and defensive living in their own homes. And we never get ahead of it, right? And so constant repairs can be more expensive over the long run. And to the extent that we're talking building envelope or anything to do with water getting into construction materials, it's almost certainly going to cost significantly more to delay. And so, yeah, we can sometimes band-aid things and we'd rely on an expert to satisfy our duty of reasonable diligence to see if we could prioritize certain repairs, maybe push some other ones out. But if they're telling us that we have to do it, you can get a second opinion. But at the end of the day, you might be throwing good money after bad. And as you continue to push out that ultimate replacement cost continues to get more expensive, right? Because we're fighting against inflation on the total value of the deferred maintenance. And, you know, we hear this with boards sometimes, you know, it's the sunk cost fallacy. Oh, we put in, you know, $20,000 patching the roofs, so we don't want to lose that by replacing the roofs, you know, this year, or the siding or the pavement or what have you. You know, and sometimes that can be good money spent, but I think most of the time, if an expert's saying you just need to bite the bullet and replace it so that you can buy yourself 10 or 20 years of peace, depending on what it is, that's the way to go. And sometimes, you know, it's an easier decision to make small repairs that are familiar to us. We get a roofer out there that says, yeah, I can make small repairs and buy another year. Well, what if you have 15 roof leaks in the course of that year and have interior unit damage? You know, maybe we wish that would have taken on that larger project. It comes with some uncertainty, you know, but it's always harder to deal with uncertainty in bigger projects than it is to do the small stuff that is familiar, but it's the small familiar stuff that's going to keep us where we are, where we don't want to be. Losing to inflation. So Robert Nordland's on this call, I believe. He's a national expert, reserve study expert. And it came up, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but we were bantering about the value of investing reserve funds that we do possess in more aggressive investments. You know, and boards and homeowners will say, oh, you know, you're not making the money work for me, and I can do better on my own. And that's true. They can and should be able to invest in more risky assets themselves. And I don't want to put words in Robert's mouth, but his point was, well, it's very, very hard to explain the loss of reserve fund principal balances due to market risk. And I've seen that happen when the market turns and the investments are tied to some market index. It's a very depressing feeling. And there's often witch hunts, of the people who were the ones who were complaining that we're not making enough money on the reserves. The first people that line up to criticize you if the fund balance goes down. But this argument about 2%, 3%, 5%, it's relevant, but it's not particularly relevant to the cost of losing to inflation, which is that the entire deferred maintenance balance of everything that needs to be done is getting more expensive every year according to inflation. So we're fighting over this relatively small amount of money, which is just a portion of what we need usually to fund all of the projects, when the entire project is just getting further and further down the road, larger due to inflation and construction cost increases. So it's like, okay, this, we do want to see if we can be diligent about getting a responsible rate of return, but we can never lose sight of the fact that we're losing to inflation if we don't have the money in the bank. Brian?
Exactly. I agree. Great.
And so people will say, and I've had this happen dozens of times, I can invest my money better than the association can. That's true. You might be a CPA. You might be a community manager. Who knows what your qualifications are? You probably can't. You have the ability to invest and risk your investments. However, and the other one as well, we just wait till something fails and then we specially assess. And I've seen governing documents in extremely high-end communities, very, very wealthy places where people fly in to their condo to go to the ballet and then they fly out the next day and nobody lives there. And they just say, hey, we're not going to put money in the reserve account. You just tell us and we'll make a capital call immediately. And that can work, right? That could work for a very, very small subset of all of the communities in our state. But for me, the issue is, you might be the best money manager in America, but it's not just about you. Do you trust your neighbors to have the same financial skills that you have? Because if they don't, and we have to sue them, or they pay over 18 months, which is allowed in Colorado law, even though you can't pay your insurance premiums over 18 months, you, as the person who is the financial expert, who has the money, you will end up holding the bag, right? Because it's always the people in every level of our society that have the money that pay the money for the people that don't. And this is no exception, right? So you might be a great money manager, but how willing are you to pay 50% more on that assessment to cover the defaults of your neighbors? And if we simply bite the bullet and put the money in the reserve fund, we minimize the risk of having those big special assessments that are abrupt where we have defaults, right? So it's not all about them. It comes back to them in the form of subsidizing their neighbors. Brian?
Yes. And so this is a slide to kind of help articulate what David's been trying to say. Whether you have a jet-setting owner who flies in and flies out, or you have someone who's barely scraping by, for both set of those owners, if we could just show them the data, we could show them the numbers, everyone feels better if they're paying less money towards something. You want better value, less money. We generally all understand that's better. So here's a hypothetical situation. We have let's just say it's a 15-year roof we need to replace. So it's a 15 years. We're receiving just 1% interest at our bank account right now, and we need to fund a $250,000 project. So it's $250,000 project over 15 years at 1% interest. Now, if at that time, at 15 years, we have not saved a dime because we said we're just going to rely on a loan, we're going to get the bank to help us. Well, we've now paid $320,000 for that $250,000 project, right? We spent much more money than we needed to, all because we decided it wasn't worth budgeting for. Sorry, if you can go back to that other one.
Sorry about that.
If you special assess, of course, now the cost is going to be $250,000. And again, it affects one subset of owners or ownership, depending on how you split that up. But the last one over here on the left side, the $231,000, that tells us if we are putting our money away diligently every single year over 15 years, even at a nominal rate of 1% interest, we're actually saving our association $20,000, right? Because that's compounding interest working in the favor of the association. And I can show you on the next slide what that looks like and how the power of compounding inflation works. So I ran a study here to establish what impact does moving your reserve account from a 1 interest-bearing account to a 2% interest-bearing account, so a 1-point increase. And what I found is that there's about almost a 7% decrease in your reserve transfer recommendation, meaning for every point that for every point increase for your bank account, whether you're moving it from a 1% whatever account to a 2% yielding account, theoretically, you could lower your reserve transfer rate by 7%. Now, we wouldn't recommend that. Rather, we'd say just take that interest, put it back in the reserve account, let the money work for the association, because the compounding interests work in the favor of the association. And then the other thing to remember is when we're doing ongoing reserve transfers, not every single owner is going to be living at that property for that hypothetical like 15 years, right? You might have 2 or 3 owners in a particular unit during that entire time. So the cost per owner is drastically smaller than it would be for that one set of ownership that gets special assessed or for that one set of ownership that has to get a loan. So it's the cheapest and most affordable option for everybody. And again, I think that argument would work for the very elite wealthy or those who really can't make ends meet, right? We all want to make sure we're not putting more money in places we don't need it. If you can utilize your savings better than the HOA, well, then great. Give them less money than you have to by putting your money into the reserve account and letting it work for you.
So, the illusion of control, we see this all the time. And, I think it's mathematically certain that the people who complain about the association not earning enough interest on its reserve fund contribution fund are the first to line up and criticize the board if there's any potential loss of principal. I mean, everyone thinks they can do better on their own, even when, or especially when they have evidence, there's evidence to the contrary. And there's a lot of psychological studies on social trust and shared risk. When the trust of putting the money in the association's account decreases, people don't do it. And this is to some degree a factor in some of these assessment veto votes I've been to over the last 25 years, where people just are not willing to entrust the association with their money, even when they've been explained, it's been told to them that that's the best thing for them in the long haul. And then there's the tragedy of the commons, which was based on I think 1968 paper written by an ecologist where he talked about this concept of a shared village pasture, where it was in every villager's self-interest to add one more cow to the pasture until there was no grass left and they all had to go somewhere else. And this is relevant for association group dynamics, where people will often act in their own short-term self-interest and they destroy the benefit that comes with living collectively, where they can share some of the risks of water leaks and fires and share the costs of replacing a common roof. But if everyone acts in their own short-term self-interest, it doesn't work. So this is one that I've had. I call it the green banana syndrome. I'm not going to be around to see the roofs that we're paying for these future owners to live in, right? The fund is being perceived as giving no value to the current owners. And that's just not accurate, right? The owners will say, why should we give them this gift? We won't be around. And I've had people say, I'll be dead by the time we have to replace the roof again, right? It's not really much negotiation or convincing you can do with somebody who's hoping to not outlive the roof, right? But there's things that we can say. Brian?
And the things that we should say are reframing the conversation entirely. Again, what are the expectations when you're getting a reserve study or when you're having a topic of reserve studies? Never frame the conversation as a reserve study helps us prepare for the future, or the reserve study will tell us how much money we need for the future, because the future is now somebody else. It's not me. It's some other Joe Schmo who I don't know. I don't know who he is, if he has kids, if he has got a, if things are hard on him right now. That's his problem to worry about in the future. But if we reframe the conversation as being, this is my problem. I have an obligation. I am a member of the HOA. Therefore, I agreed when I live in this HOA, I'm going to pay for my fair share of the ongoing rate of deterioration of the common area elements. And when I agree to pay for my fair share, I pay my reserve bill each and every year. And when I pay my reserve bill each and every year, the future will take care of itself. But again, we cannot frame it as being the future. Rather, we have to frame it as a current obligation that we all need to take on.
Totally. Yeah, you're wearing it out now. And if you ever plan to sell, good luck with that, right? It only works if everyone pays their share. And the psychology term is hyperbolic discounting, right? They dramatically undervalue the future rewards compared to the present ones, right? And so when we talk about the future, it's like, dismissed outright. I don't really care about the future, even if you promise me great things. But right now, I worry about it. And so that's why Brian is saying we have to reframe this for the future. You're paying for what you use as you use it, I think is a way better explanation. And then it minimizes this decline that then has to be, a catch up later. Impact on resale. I'll just move out before we special assess. Well, go for it, Brian.
Right. So again, if we follow the train of thought here, we've had the board, we've encouraged them to get the reserve study done. They're surprised by the expense. They then say, can we just push this aside? Can we just defer this? Well, fine. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm worried about the expenses. Let's kind of focus in on our interest rates. Is that the issue? Can we maybe out earn, because I don't want to spend all this money? Maybe we need to put our assets in a more risky investment. And then again, we go back to, okay, fine. Well, now I'm faced with the reality of this kind of not going away. Can we push this on somebody else? Because I'm not going to live here when we have to pay for this, right? So we're going through just the natural psychology of an annual meeting where you start to experience all these levels of frustration, right? And so now you might start to have some owners thinking in their brains, okay, this is bad news potentially. And again, we don't want to frame the reserve study as bad or good news. It is just data that we want to present to make wise financial choices. But again, you may have an owner that says to themselves, all right, I need to get out of here. That maybe is my only move here. And so they don't want to special assess now. They might vote against the special assessment because they say, well, I might move out. And then someone else will have to special assess. But the thing is, we want to warn everyone is that now lenders are actually starting to pay attention. I had a call last week with an owner saying, or excuse me, a manager telling me that her owners in one of her communities, there's a couple hundred units in this community, they could not sell their units. And so they were calling me rather frantically, telling me I need to update this reserve study now because we need to get this fixed so that these owners can sell their units. And why is that? Well, there have been new guidelines on Fannie and Freddie. And so what are some of the guidelines I want to point out to you? Well, there's just 3 bullet points that are helpful to understand is that Fannie and Freddie's guidelines have changed. Therefore, the lenders are now looking at reserves and reserve studies and the condos and the different stacked units differently. And those guidelines stipulate, number 1, you need to have a reserve study completed within the last 36 months. The reserve study should be prepared by an independent, skilled expert in performing such reserve studies. And the reserve study must comment favorably on some of the major components at the association. So we're starting to see that just like the insurance side, the lending side is now acting in their own self-interest, right? Sometimes people say, well, what will the state do to get involved within reserves? Well, now we're finding that the other industries that are involved in the HOAs, whether that be lending and insurance, are now saying, well, we're going to make a decision now because we cannot be left, as David said earlier, holding the bag on some of these mortgages that default because people can't pay them back due to deferred maintenance and there's just no money left, or to a building being condemned, or potentially buildings falling apart. So the industry itself is wisening up, right? And so this is just what I heard when I first moved to Colorado. I started to hear clients tell me, we're not going to fund for our roofs because the insurance company is going to pay for it when the hailstorm comes, right? So don't put that on in our reserve study. But if we go to the next slide, you can see that this has changed, right? So this is based on a 2023 CAI survey that has about 10,000 communities represented in this finding in the survey. And of the representatives, 91% of them had premium increases. Of the respondents, 50% had to then raise their dues to then pay for the increases, and then 7% of them had to special assess. So again, we're finding that other industries are getting involved and starting to change the way that associations need to look at their budgets, because the insurance side has now taken up so much of the operational costs of the association. So we now need to make sure that our operational side, our operating budget, can stand on its own, and our reserve budget need to be able to stand on its own. So we need the money. We need to make sure that collections are coming in for your HOA to pay for these operational costs as well as these reserve costs, because it's impacting us on both sides now, from the insurance side and on the lending side. And so how then can we make sure that we are staying on pace with our reserve expenses, right? If we know that our operational costs are what they are, and again, the insurance side is taking a large part of that, how can we then keep track of our reserve expenses? Well, the best way to do that, if you see on the next slide, is to update your reserve study. And the more frequently you update your reserve study, the better it is for your association, because we're going to have fresh or updated information. If you wait just 3 years per those guidelines, as we saw on the other slide, 36 months, if you just wait 3 years, that meets the guideline standards, but you're still at risk for special assessments, because we found that when associations update their reserve study every single year, their special assessment risk decreases by 28% relative to those associations that wait 3 years. If you wait 5 years, well, your risk goes up to 35%, right? And that makes sense. Imagine if you got a proposal to do a project in 2020, and then 5 years later, today, you go back to that contractor and say, I'm ready to execute on this project. Can we go ahead? Well, they're going to tell you, no way, right? We got to redo the proposal. Costs have changed. Labor costs have changed. There's tariffs now, right? There's so much changing ongoing. We have to update, get fresh information within our reserve study. So now we can have our reserve account stand on its own.
Yeah. We hear people saying, oh, sorry, this is a conclusion. If I lived in an apartment, I wouldn't have to do this. Well, you wouldn't have to worry about it because the landlord would do it for you. And if you didn't pay your rent, you would be out. And because these are your homes, the homeowners have the ability to make decisions that aren't in their long-term best interest. And I agree, Brian, when you have a clear reserve study and you look at it, continuously talk about it in front of your members, it raises the consciousness of the true cost of ownership in that community. And it kind of turns the Titanic around in some cases. The problem, I think, is when we get these big numbers, the reserve study says, we couldn't put you further past zero if we tried in the percent funded, and people get overwhelmed and they say, oh, what's the point? Well, the point is to start, right? Because the projects will demand the money when they demand the money. And somehow that money will be collected. May not be pretty, but it will be collected and paid for. It's just a reality. And people on the news, I see, oh, we voted the assessment down, for insurance premiums. Well, that doesn't mean you don't need insurance, right? And it's such an interesting thing that, this trust is gone, and there's a lack of recognition that this HOA is run by the people for the people. So, to me, this is too big a project to continue to do it with a homemade reserve study or no reserve study. And it's way too stressful for a board and for a management team. And management teams, I've never seen management teams say, oh, you should decrease your assessments. Why? Because they know what things cost to replace, right? And there's sometimes economic times where the board say, hey, we're not going to put in the reserve fund contribution this season, this budget season, because of the economy or what have you. And you might be able to do that once in a while. But at the end of the day, the property is continuously deteriorating, right? We don't have to win today, but we do have to start today. And I've gotten to the point, and it's not a flattering admission, where I'm not as invested in the outcome as I used to be. I've been to a lot, thousands of association meetings and seen a lot of crazy things. And I've started to worry less about the outcome for the owners because I know psychologically that there's loss aversion and hyperbolic discounting and sometimes the Dunning-Kruger effect and all of, this temporal bias and all of these things that lead to illogical conclusions. And so my focus, in going to these meetings is trying to give people the best information that we can without us getting cynical about the outcome. And that may mean that a vote has to be tried and failed. And maybe we have to start over with a grassroots campaign and a committee and information and trying to continue to have this conversation. But I used to get frustrated, and I sometimes still get frustrated with people making these obviously bad decisions that can jeopardize their ability to live in their homes. But now I understand it, maybe I'm just at a place in my career where it's like, okay, well, that I can't control, but I can control how clear and how respectful we can have the conversation so that they can make the decision. And maybe the decision isn't the one we want today, but the sooner we start having these conversations and putting it in front of the owners, if that's what we have to do in the state that you're in, the sooner we can start to make people realize this is a big deal. So if you're a manager or a leader, you want to, I think, temper your emotional investment in the outcome and rechannel that to how do we get our people as educated, as informed, as aware of this issue as we can, and how can we support them in making the decision that ultimately they will come to. We just don't know exactly when that will be. There's a couple questions in the chat here.
Yeah.
How accurate are professional reserve studies?
Yeah. So this is a question. It's a very legitimate question, right? Because if you're going to get pushback from the owners of should we get a reserve study done? What I like to tell clients is 40% of the job is going to your site, right? If we're hired to do what's called a full or a with site visit, meaning we're going to your property to look at the components, 40% of our time is spent on site. 60% of our time is actually doing the back end research, calling vendors, calling manufacturers, reaching out to contractors to make sure that our pricing is up to date. Really, that is kind of where we need to make sure that our numbers are right. And so we're every single day updating our pricing sheets to make sure that we're in line with what we're seeing today. And as we had said on that last slide, if you're utilizing a reserve study even from 2 years ago and you say, hey, this report, these numbers aren't actually what we saw, well, there's a reason for that, right? We're seeing that costs are increasing greatly. I actually just heard a report today that there's now new costs, new tariffs or whatever they are. I know it's changing all the time, but it's more just to say there's new costs I think going to be on cabinets and like unique items like that. So we have to be aware, we have to be nimble, and the data that we have today may not be relevant next year. So get that reserve study updated, make sure that our costs are accurate by getting that reserve study updated.
Yeah, and there's it's a professional inquiry, right? That comes at, in my opinion, a discounted cost. We could hire an engineer, we could hire an insurance appraiser, we could spend $40,000-$50,000, get a structural engineer out there. Most of the reserve studies that I see, not all of them, are not as detailed as that, and they cost a fraction of that, but they give us good data based on the quantities and based on the database of information that the reserve study expert can access together with their experience, right? And so it's not a guarantee, it's not a crystal ball, but if you hire somebody who knows what they're doing, it's for the cost, it's quite an amazing piece of data. Could you get more detailed data? Yes, you could. You could hire engineers, but they would also still be projecting, an estimate on the cost of inflation and future replacement costs, and to some extent, they would be estimating the remaining useful life. So for me, it's a very healthy balance of an expense relative to the data that you get. I hope I didn't impugn what you do, Brian, but that's how I see it.
No, I would agree. I mean, what we'll find is if there's a particular issue that the association is struggling with, whether it be sewer lines, electrical, foundation, well, please at that point, you need to reach out to a specialist. You need to have someone actually inspect that, like a structural engineer, sewer lines, those need to be scoped out. We can inspect those items on site. Therefore, get a professional for those particular items. Then we
Yeah.
can implement those findings within the reserve study. We now need to disclose that data in the reserve study itself. And if they do find, for example, if you have a retaining wall and you're afraid there might be an issue with it, we'll hire a structural engineer. They can do the assessment that David just mentioned, and they may say, no, it's totally fine. There's no issues with it. This thing is in great shape. Or they might say, you know what? After digging it out, after doing our forensic testing, doing core sampling, we found there's some issues.
Yeah, and you can get some guidance from the reserve professional to tell you this is outside the scope of what we can do, right? But from where I sit for a number of our clients, at least to the extent that I know, we don't really know what most of our clients have in the bank, and we don't get copies of the reserve study. So we don't, just based on my experience in going to meetings, if everyone had a professional reserve study as a society or as 10,000 HOAs in Colorado, we would be significantly better off than where we are now. And if we needed to go further on that for specific expertise in certain trades, we could do that. But it's a huge first step, and it's just not that expensive. There's no excuse that I see for not having better data from outside the community when we are talking to our owners about the true cost of ownership in that community.